So, nightly co-sponsors, Anonymous, dedicated in honor of Bubby and Zadie Roseman and Bubby and Zadie Berger. And for the Refuah Shalem of Menachem Mendel, Ben Sarah Batya and Dvor Fega Bat Rezo. Okay. Also, I want to just, I'm sorry, go ahead, you were saying Refuah Shalem for?
Refuah Shlema לסולצ'ה זיווה בת בלנקה.
סולצ'ה זיווה בת בלנקה.
לסיגל בת אסתר.
סיגל בת אסתר.
And the entire world.
The entire world. Also, I want to just dedicate this Friday is the birthday of my son, Mordechai Shlomo David HaKohen. So we want to wish him a good year. Okay, so please people, let's like and share. Let's all become partners in the great work of the Lighthouse Project, spreading Torah all around. Okay, so let's jump right into it. Be the profiteer of your suffering. That's the name of the title of tonight's class. So, profiteering. You know what profiteering means? Profiteering is viewed as a negative act. The definition of profiteering is, and I quote, make or seek to make an excessive or unfair profit, especially illegally or in a black market. However, why would I tell you to be a profiteer if you just read the definition? However, this is only concerning one profiteering from another person's suffering. That's not a good thing. One should not be making excessive or unfair profit because another person's in a tight situation. As you know, Jewish law doesn't even allow to take interest on a loan. So, that is only another person's profiting.
Only from Jews?
Yes. That is only concerning profiteering from another person's suffering. The absolute positive and even mandatory profiteering is to profiteer, the profiteering we do from our own suffering. Okay? So we can't try to make excessive profit off someone else's suffering, God forbid, but we are actually obligated to make excessive profit off our own suffering. Otherwise, we're suffering in vain. So let's talk about this. It has been said that the reason why Jewish people don't drink is because it interferes with their suffering. That's the Jewish perspective. Why would I drink? It's interfering with my suffering. Which leads us to our modern day issue of this lecture. There is a perverse form of righteousness. I'm saying this very clearly. There is a perverse form of righteousness that stops us from profiteering from our suffering. When in truth, from God's point of view, the only reason that we are suffering is for us to profiteer from the suffering. So to think that I don't want to get in the way of my suffering, because we'll soon see, if God forbid, I profit from my suffering, then I'm taking away from the tikkun, from the kapara, from the punishment, whatever it's going to be, very perverse. So, nevertheless, in our perverse understanding of sin and punishment, we are afraid to profit at all. Never mind excessive or unfair profit from this illegal black market of God's punishment upon us. Truth be said, that this notion of not profiting when you're being punished has a Talmudic source. The Talmud itself rules that the law must be careful of shelo yehei choiten niske, that the sinner should not profit. However, there, the Talmud's focus is on the sinner not making selfish profit, which would lead him to believe that it is worthwhile sinning. Last time I sinned, I got punished. I made a good profit from the punishment. That's what we don't want. What if we are speaking of a person who is willing to do teshuvah, return repentance? What is the ultimate teshuvah? In realizing that all benefits are not for sole selfish purpose, but of serving God and his fellow man. As a matter of fact, in holiday prayers we state, why are we in exile? So we say in our prayers, because of our sins we have been exiled from our land and have been distanced from our land. What does that mean? That the reason we're in exile is a punishment. But now look at what a different teaching the Talmud says. The Holy One, blessed be He, did not exile Israel among the nations, save in order that proselytes might join them. For it is said, and I will sow her into me in the land. Surely a man sows a sa'ah, a small measurement of seeds, in order to harvest many kor, a large measurement. How interesting. So on one hand, the reason we were banished from Israel, kicked out of Israel, distant from our land, was why? Was because of our sins. It's a punishment. The Talmud says that you can't profit. Yet what does the same Talmud say in a different book, a tractate in Pesachim? It says that God did not take us out of Israel and disperse us amongst the nations only for, if it would have said, the Talmud would have said that God did this for this, we could have said, okay, there's more than one reason. But look at the language. The language here is, did not exile Israel amongst the nations, save in order. The only reason is that we should gather the converts who are going to enter into the Jewish people. Yet, majority of the people do not know how to profiteer from their own suffering. And with this, the suffering becomes permanently real. If I don't profit from my suffering, then my suffering becomes permanently real. No mistake is a mistake in vain unless you haven't profited from it. If I learn something from it, it's not a mistake in vain. For it serves no greater purpose for God and for God's universe. In this Maimer of the Rebbe, based on the Jewish purpose in exile, we will overcome our need for suffering's purpose, and unleash God's gift of potential within suffering. So now you know what the modern day issue is. Okay? Somehow, somewhere, the purpose of suffering is not just when you're having a cup of coffee with your friend, you should give the Jewish, eternal, all-encompassing krechs, oy, and my suffering. That's not why we suffer. We don't suffer to wear it as a badge of honor, and then war scars. No. There's only one reason why we suffer, ultimately, and that is to be able to profiteer from our own suffering. Literally profiteer. Make excessive, not just cash in. If you're just cashing in from your suffering, then the investment didn't bring back good returns. Why suffer? We're literally talking about making excessive, unfair profits from our suffering. Then suffering has a purpose and it's fulfilling a greater good. Okay? So, well, obviously questions we can ask, why does it have to be through suffering? Why can't it be through other ways? This class will answer that, and if you want after the class, I can show you why it's that way from teachings of this class based on chapter 27, letter 27, and then chapters 27, 28, 29 in Tanya talking about suffering. Okay? So why does it have to be? Why can't I just have unfair profit from goodness? Why do I have to go through suffering to get unfair profit? So we'll talk about that. It will explain itself in this class, but after the class we can focus directly on those words. Okay? So let's jump right into it. King Solomon in his book of songs, Shir HaShirim, he states, "You who sit in the gardens, the friends hearken to your voice, let me hear it." Okay? Hayoshev Baganim, those who are sitting in the gardens, the friends hearken to your voice, let me hear it. So first of all, there's friends, and then God says, let me hear it. Who are the friends? The angels. Who's me? God. For let me hear it, capital M. Okay? But what are the gardens? What gardens are we talking about? So, there is Rashi, Rab Shlomo Yitzchaki, famous commentator of the 11th century, and he is the best commentator to study when you want to know the simple definition. Not getting caught up in homiletics and extrapolations. Rashi was a school teacher of the young children, and his job was, as he writes in the Chumash in the beginning of his commentaries, Ani lo bati, I did not come, el lefarish, only to explain pshuto shel mikra, the simple meaning of the verse. Okay? And what does Rashi say? Rashi says, who are these gardens? So let me share with you what Rashi says in this verse. The Holy One, blessed be He, says to the congregation of Israel, you who are scattered in exile, grazing in the gardens of strangers, and sitting in synagogues and study halls. So you see here the gardens have two meanings, and they're both connected. Gardens over here means the gardens of strangers, i.e. galut, exile. However, within the gardens of strangers, what do we mean more specifically? Where in the gardens of strangers are the Jewish people sitting that God's saying, friends are listening, and let me listen? In the study hall and in the house of prayer. Bate knesiot I bate medrashot. So we have here two meanings, but they are one and the same. In other words, if you're sitting in the shul in the times of King Solomon when you're not in exile, this verse doesn't apply. When does this verse apply? Is when you're sitting in the house of prayer, in the house of study, when you're in exile in the gardens of strangers. Okay? So, we need to understand why. Why was the praying and the studying Torah when we weren't in the garden of strangers, but we were living in Israel with the Holy Temple? That is not what the verse is talking about. Something's lacking in that situation. Only when you're in the garden of strangers, and there you're making sure to go to shul and to yeshiva and to study and to pray, then you have this verse. Okay? To understand this lecture, I'm going to have to introduce two other verses that the Rebbe quotes in the Maimer. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce those two verses right now, explain them, and then we'll be able to move on. There's a verse immediately following this verse. The verse I just read to you is chapter 8, verse 13. Verse 14 says as follows: Flee, my beloved, and liken yourself to a gazelle or to a fawn of the hinds on the spice mountains. Harei Psamim. This verse is speaking to the Jewish people, saying to God, flee like a gazelle from this exile and run to the spice mountains, which refer to Mount Moriah, Temple Mount in Yerushalayim. How are you? We'll soon talk about what the connection between Mount Moriah, Temple Mount, and Mount Spice Mountains is all about. You know that in Walt Disney they have the Space Mountains. This is Spice Mountains. Okay? Let's talk about another verse. This verse is far earlier, before we do the sitting in the gardens. The verse mentions some ways before our verse is, and watch how close this is. Go around, liken yourself, my beloved, to a gazelle or to a fawn of the hinds on distant mountains. Once again we have the gazelle. Once again we have the fawn of the hinds. But this time we're talking about distant mountains. Harei Baser. Not Harei Psamim. This verse is speaking of God being in exile, distant mountains with us, being like a gazelle who sleeps with one eye open, and like a fawn which always looks back, meaning that God, even in exile, is watching over us. Why the gazelle and why the fawn on the hinds? Because the gazelle, we're taught, the tzvi, whenever it is sleeping, it's always sleeping with one eye open. That's what our sages tell us. Always keeping an eye out. Therefore, we're referring to God even when he is in a state of sleep, which Kabbalistically means that the presence of God is in exile, a state of sleep. You know, when you sleep, your higher faculties aren't working. It's your lower faculties that are working. So therefore, when we talk about exile, in which the great revelation of the divine presence is not functioning, it's more the lower revelation, it is concealment, contraction. That's what we call exile, state of sleep. What's about the fawn of hinds? So we're taught that whenever it runs, it always looks back. It's always looking back. And therefore, once again, our sages tell us that is referring to God. Always, even though he sent us into exile, he's always looking back at us. Okay? Now, we have the distant mountains, and we have the spice mountains. Let's talk about this. But let's go ahead and let's go take on a deeper look into the spice mountain and distant mountains, and we're able to see what we're talking about. And at this point, we're going to give you a list of the mystical concepts we're going to talk about in order to put together this class. Number one, there's the body, external, and the soul, internal, of exile. Number one, right? I did mention that to you a little before. We're going to quote it again. On one hand, because of our sins, we went into exile. On the other hand, God is sowing seeds in order to reap a great harvest. There's an internal and an external. Then we have to understand what a spice mountain is. Then we have to understand what a distant mountain is. Then we have to understand two major stuff in the Holy Temple. Every day we brought the incense. The incense represents the number 11. If you look in the Torah, how many different kinds of spices did you use in the daily Ketoret? Was 11. We'll talk about that. While sacrifice represents 10. So you have sacrifices, you have incense, one is 10, one is 11. The last thing we're going to talk about as we close it up is the seeds and its harvest. So let the amazement of Chassidus begin. Okay, let's go back into this verse. Let's explain this verse. Hayoshevet baganim, you're sitting in those who sit in the gardens, friends are hearkening to your voice, and then let me hear it. Let's talk about this. So, the word sitting, those who sit in the gardens, Hayoshevet. Hayoshevet has two interpretations. It simply means to sit, temporarily sitting. But then it also has a different meaning, and we see it in the Talmud. I'll quote you, the Talmud says as follows. Rabbi Yochanan said, sitting, Yoshev, here means only staying, as it says, and he stayed in Kadesh many days. So we have the external definition, which is temporarily sitting, but then we have the more internal, which is the more established staying. Okay? Now we understand what's going on here. When we talk about the gardens of strangers, the Jew has to know we're only sitting there temporarily. But when we're talking about within exile, where do we focus? When we buy a house, we ask a real estate agent, right, a couple of serious questions. We want to know the school district, the kids. But as a Jew, you want to know, where's the shul? Where's the shul? Is there a shul in the neighborhood? Am I in walking distance, or whatever it may be? You want to make sure there's a shul in the neighborhood. That means that the Jew realizes what? The Jew realizes that while I'm temporarily sitting in the gardens of strangers, I need to establish that I am staying in a shul. I'm staying close to a place where I can study Torah and where I can have a minyan, where I can bring the family and so forth and so on. Thus you have the external and the internal of the word Yoshevet. We're sitting, those who are sitting in the gardens. Okay? Now, let's go to the next words. What does it mean, the friends hearken to your voice? What does that mean? Friends represent angels. How do we know the friends represent angels? Because there is a teaching of the great Medrash Rabbah on this verse that says something very interesting. The reason why we know that angels are called friends, because unlike humans, amongst angels there is no jealousy, there is no hatred, there is no competitiveness. I don't need you to fall for me to grow. Thus immediately we know that the true word friends exists amongst angels. Now what are these angels doing? They're hearkening to our voice. What exactly does it mean, hearkening to our voice? Why do we need angels hearken to our voice? Why do we need God telling us, you should know, don't worry, when you daven and when you study Torah, the angels are listening? The answer is because there's a teaching of our sages in Kohelet. We talk about this concept that the angels have to megafafin. Megafafin means embrace. Mechapkim, they have to hug. Menashkin, they have to kiss. Every letter of prayer or Torah study that is uttered by a human being is egocentric. By the mere words that we know, humans aren't called friends. Not that level of friends, where there's no jealousy and there's no, that doesn't exist. We're egocentric. And therefore, our words of prayer, our letters of prayer, and our words and letters of Torah study is stained by the one stain that doesn't allow it to go to heaven. Because heaven is all about purity, selflessness, theocentric. What does the verse say? I and he cannot coexist. The one thing that forces us out of a face-to-face relationship with God is ego. And therefore, the minute it's the human who's praying, no matter how much he's praying, trying to give it all he has, all she has, it's got to be egocentric. Which, by the way, without getting carried away, by simple definition, if I pray for your needs, I did not fulfill the mitzvah of prayer. I have to pray for my needs. Right there, we're talking about egocentric. It's interesting. The Talmud says, we learn out from a story in the Torah, he who prays for his friend and he needs the same thing gets answered first. So if I needed a refuah shlema and you needed a refuah shlema and I pray for you, I get answered first. So what's going to happen if I pray for you because I know that I'm not praying for you? Ego, the human ego. Thus, no matter how selfless we are, we need angels to polish up our stuff. Thus, on a deeper level, when Hashem tells us, friends, those who don't have ego, are hearkening to your voice, what he's telling us is, don't worry. You're egocentric. I created you that way. Survival is the deepest instinct of any living creature. Thus, by definition, you are innately egocentric. But I'm sending the friends, and they'll polish your stains. It will go up to heaven. What goes on after that? The next closing part of the statement is, let me, God, hear it. Once it's polished up, let me, God, hear it. Let's focus on this. Rashi says, and afterwards they will declare God's sanctity, as it is said in the verse in Job, when the morning stars sing together, these are the Israelites, and afterwards and all the angels of God will shout. Why are the angels shouting? Why does anyone shout? Joy. Overwhelmed. Wow. Once the power of the human service of letters go up to heaven, once they're polished, they reach to a place which even overwhelms the angels. Let me, God, hear it. Thus now, in the first stage, the angels were higher helping us. In the second stage, we are the ones who sanctify, to the point where now the angels are screaming from being overwhelmed by how far the Jewish prayer and the Torah study reaches. Much higher than anywhere where the angels themselves can reach. Okay? So now we understand what's going on here. We understand that we're reaching to a place through going ahead and sitting in the gardens. I'm sorry, just make sure that I turned it off. Through sitting in the gardens, what am I now hearing? What I'm now hearing is that when I'm studying Torah in exile, when I'm praying in exile, what's happening? I'm reaching higher than angels can reach. I'm reaching to let me hear it. Me, capital M. Okay? Okay. So, let's go further. What we're now hearing is that specifically when we're sitting in the gardens of, that still we need to understand. Why can't everything about this verse apply to when we're sitting in King Solomon's days? The first temple, where everything was beautiful, no exile. From everything we just said now, why is it specifically only when we're sitting in the gardens of strangers, distant mountains, do we reach that level, after the help of angels, polishing it up, where we're going to let me hear it? Okay? So, to fully understand this, we are going to now dive into the next concept, the difference between the spice mountain and the distant mountain. Okay? But one thing we definitely hear. We're definitely hearing now what the profiteering is all about. We would not be able to reach this, let me listen to it, a level of such greatness where even the angels are running around screaming, short-circuiting. That is profiteering the exile. Okay? Let's go further. The Zohar The Zohar says upon the story with Isaac and Jacob. What happened with Isaac and Jacob? So Isaac told Esau, I'm going to die, make me food, and I'm going to bless you. Rebecca hears this, calls in Jacob and tells Jacob, you got to go. And what happens because of that? He says, but 1 second, what happens if he touches me? Daddy touches me. In 1 second he'll realize I'm not Jacob, I'm not Esau, I'm Jacob. Jacob is hairy. So she puts on special clothes. He goes in. Very interesting verse. The verse says, and he, Isaac, smelled the fragrance of his garments and he blessed him. There's like some type of connection here because he smelled the fragrance of his garden. So there's different interpretations. I'm going to share with you one. He sensed the fragrance of Mount Moriah. Interesting what the Zohar says. What did he smell when he smelled his clothing? Isaac smelled Jacob's clothing. What did he pick up that all of a sudden he wanted to bless him? The scent of Mount Moriah. Now the Zohar goes on to say, and Avram Fried has a very famous song of it, those of you who listen to Avram Fried. Lama, Lama, you know that song? Why is the mountain called Mount Moriah? It's actually from the Zohar. On behalf of the good Moor is Mir, M-Y-R-R-H in English, I have a link here, which was there. Mount Moriah is called Spice Mountain because we already find in the Zohar that Mount Moriah is called Mount Moriah because of the more special spice that was there. Okay. This is why Mount Moriah is referred to in our verse as Spice Mountain. Okay. Let's talk about this for a moment. What's so big about fragrance? Let's even take it to a further step. From a perspective of Torah study, Temple Mount served a very important. Why? From a personal thing, if you want to have atonement, yes, that's the important part. But I told you once before in this class that there's an argument between two Rishonim. What is the most important part of the Holy Temple? Is it the altar, because it's all about kapara, atonement? Or is it the ark? Because in the verse it says, from the tent of testimony will come forth the words of Torah, the words of God. Now, what we do know is, practically speaking, when you learn Tractate Sanhedrin, there's the courthouse of 3, there's the courthouse of 23, and then there's the courthouse of 71, actually. Why do you have 71? That's the main opinion that we follow. Because if you remember when Moses told God, I can't do this by myself no more. So God told him, gather 70 elders and I will bring forth from your spirit on his spirit. So the major opinion, which says it's 71 and not 70, says you have 70 sages with Moses, who is the head of that courthouse. You have 71. Now 71, the courthouse of 71, which was in that room in the Holy Temple called the room of the Gazit, the cutout rocks, Lishkat HaGazit, that was Supreme Court. And the Talmud tells us, and the Rambam clearly explains it to us, the system that whenever rabbis did not know the answer, they went to the higher court, and if they couldn't get an answer, they brought it to Temple Mount, and the Supreme Court could not disadjourn until they came up with an answer. And thus, you only had one opinion ruling over the entire people of Israel. So the Temple Mount, actually from a halachic perspective, from a Torah study perspective, is the center. My question then, so why are we referring to it as Harei Psamim? What does fragrance have to do with Torah study? To understand that, we're going to turn to a piece of Talmud upon a verse in Isaiah. And let's see what it says over there. Let me read to you the exact verse. And he shall be animated by the fear of God, and neither with the sight of his eyes shall he judge, nor with the hearing of his ears shall he chastise. Expounds the Talmud. Rabbi said, he smells a man and judges, as it is written, and he shall not judge after the sight of his eyes, neither reprove from the hearing of his ears, yet with righteousness shall he judge the poor. Interesting. What's going on here? So to understand, I read it to you in English, and he shall be animated. But you should know that the Hebrew word for that, and he shall be animated, is veherichu. Thus, this opinion is saying, the word veherichu comes from the word reach. What does reach mean? Smell. Thus, we hear that Mashiach is called, he, in the verse of Isaiah, is talking about Mashiach. We hear that Mashiach is called Moira Vadoin. He is the one that has absolute correct justice. Why? Because seeing and hearing are the faculties of the mind, which is vulnerable to perception and paradigm. Thus, it's not absolute, it's relative. However, in Kabbalah, the scent of smell touches the essence. And that is why when a person faints, what do? You take smelling salt. Because the smell, the power in Kabbalah, it says the reach, the faculty of reach, the nose goes straight up, unlike the eyes and the ears, which gets manipulated and interpreted by the brain. The nose goes straight up to the soul. Thus you'll see when someone is feeling faint, weak, a smell will wake him up to the point where if he fainted, smell will bring him back. So in Kabbalah, what is the definition of faint? In Kabbalah, the definition of faint is that instead of the faculties of the soul shining downwards, it reversed. So you have to reach back into the essence and pull it down. Thus, smell is what reaches into the essence. Thus, we now understand that even in Torah study, Mashiach has what no one else had, including Moses, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and thus we're taught clearly that Moses, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob will be students of Mashiach. Because they were of the power of sight and hearing, while Mashiach will smell. By the way, I just want to share with you another thing. Fragrance is very big in Kabbalah. There's a story in Kabbalah where the rabbis say to a child, Raichu bil v'shaychu, I smell in your garments that you didn't say Shema today. So smell is a very important thing in Kabbalah. It's not so simple. It's the all-encompassing, it's beyond the linear permeating. Okay? So when we talk about now the Mount Moriah being referred to as Spice Mountain, we now understand that even in the depths of the houses of study, the ultimate essence, beyond the faculties of revelation, the ultimate essence is smelling. Thus we now understand why Temple Mount, which was the Supreme Court, is called fragrance. Okay? Now let's go further. I do want to make a note. I explained just now that it's called Spice Mountain specifically because of the power of smell, even concerning Temple Mount being the mount of the Supreme Court. Okay? When you always sing on Simchat Torah, Ki mitzion tetzei Torah, from Zion will come forth the words of Torah, that's what we're referring to. The Supreme Court. So we explained it. But I do want to tell you that what we're going to get into here is also another concept. When we talk about Spice Mountain, the Holy Temple had the service of incense, which I mentioned to you before. So we're going to talk about that too. Okay? But nevertheless, what do we see here? We see here that once again, specifically through this concept of, remember, verse number 13 is talking about in exile. We're sitting in the gardens of strangers and we're praying and we're studying Torah. Verse number 14, as an outcome of verse number 13, talks about Temple Mount being the Spice Mountain. Thus we now understand, connected two verses, specifically through us studying Torah in exile is where we arouse the Spice Mountain. Let's take it just a step further. If you want to really get into it, what we're understanding now is that this Spice Mountain, which is verse 14, through verse 13, that we're sitting in the gardens of strangers studying Torah and praying, we have transformed the previous verse which is the distant mountains, are what are transformed into the spice mountain. So now you understand the lineup of the three verses. Before we study Torah, before we in exile build a shul, build the place of study, so then we are stuck in the garden of strangers with distant mountains. We're soon going to explain that. However, in exile, when we make sure to build a shul and build the yeshiva, pray and study Torah, not only we're doing that, okay, on my way to work. No, this becomes the staying definition of sitting, not temporarily sitting. Then we take that previous verse, the distant mountains, we transform it into the next verse, which is the spice mountain. Okay? We still have to understand why. Okay? All of this seems to be beautiful even if we don't talk about exile. We still need to get to why specifically does it only work when we're sitting in shul in exile and not in the time of King Solomon. Okay? Remember, this class is about profiteering from suffering. It's in exile where if we go to shul, we pray and we study Torah and we realize that that's the main purpose of life. I earn a living so that I can go ahead and spend more time. And I wait for the day where I can finally go ahead and set up my company where I can have free time to spend more time studying Torah. That's what it's all about. That's when we transform the mountain distant into spice mountain. Then we go from the external revelations to the essence of smell. Okay? Let's go further. What is the distant mountains? So, in the verse, the word for distant is boser. Not to be confused with basar, which means meat. That's with a shin, with the left shin. But we're talking about basar, which is with a saf. Beis saf resh. Now, I gave you the simple definition, which is distant. However, when you want to look for the source of the word, you find a very interesting source. Do you remember the story in Genesis where Abraham cut and separated the pieces of the sacrifice and he made a covenant with God? It says, Vayiboser. Over there it means to cut and separate. Thus we now have a new definition of this mountain. It's not the distant mountain, it's the mountains of separation. The separated mountains. What does this mean in Kabbalah? To understand what this means in Kabbalah, we have to go back to Genesis and we have to look over there in chapter 2, right after creation, what the verse says and what Kabbalah does with that. So let's go ahead and look. The verse over there says, and a river flowed out of Eden to water the garden, and from there it separated and became 4 heads. What's going on here? On a mystical level, Eden is the realm of unity. Eden is within. And therefore Eden is all about absolute divinity. However, from that Eden comes forth a river, a life force. And what happens to that life force? It separates. Umisham yipared. And from there it separates. In the world of Kabbalah, we're talking about the contraction, which now went from the within Eden to the outside of Eden. And when we're outside of Eden, the very notion of outside causes separation. Now we're talking about the contracted life force, the contracted light. The minute you have an inside and an outside, and we're not all part and parcel of within God, in our paradigm, we have created now the separation which leads through the egocentric. Thus in Genesis, when right after creation he tells you that, he's telling you the secret of what's going on here. Now, the reason why God created this obviously was for the purpose that we should be able to function as free-thinking creatures. Angels are not free-thinking creatures. Anything which is within absolute divinity and unity is not separated. If you're not separated, you don't have a choice of one of two identities. If you don't have a choice of one of two identities, you're not free-thinking, you don't have freedom of choice. So we explain very often that the whole notion of contraction as a one-way mirror, where from God's view it's a simple window. God is everything and everything is God. But He created that inside and outside of Eden so that we can see a one-way mirror. So we see a separation of inside and outside. Creator, creation. That whole process of separation is a descent. So now you have mountains of separation, umisham yipara, and from there it's separated. And once you have the outside of Eden, and once you have separation, what are you going to have? 4 heads. They already see themselves as arrogant. Now, that is all, like I said, part and parcel of creation, because that's what God wanted. Now, when you talk about the human being, which is the microscopic universe, you have the same thing. You have the essence of the soul, and you have the faculties as they are within the essence. But once you start an inside and an outside, what ends up happening is that the descent rolls down to the lowest. So just like the lowest of the universe is the physical realm, that's absolute darkness from a perspective, from the perspective of the presence, revelation of God. Physical is darkness, ultimate separation. So too in the human being. When you start going down all the faculties, and then you get to the physical actions, you're talking about the lifeless physical actions, which we explained in the last two classes. Now you're talking about the ultimate mountains of separation. You can do things without thinking or feeling. This all is normal. This all is Mother Nature. And it all serves a purpose. However, this all becomes perverse when we go into a state of exile. So now, not only do you have the entire process of evolution from the infinite light, the oneness, the Eden, down to the linear finite until it's array of array, and we're dealing with the physical darkness and separation, but now, even greater than all of that, we've brought it into exile. Now understand that because the Jew has within him truly a piece of God above, because the Jew has within the smell essence, therefore when a Jew goes into exile, sinning, he has taken God into exile with him. And thus we have the verse where we're telling God, Gazelle, run from exile. Why does God have to run from exile? Take us out of exile. You're not in exile, God. Yes, He is. And thus we have the verse that says clearly, we extrapolate from the verse, that He will return. It doesn't say He will bring us back. He will return with us. And from here we learn that whenever we're in suffering, God's with us in suffering, because there's a piece of God within us, which had to go into exile with us. And thus, when we're in exile, He's in exile with us. Thus we tell Him, God, run like a gazelle. Where should you run to? Spice Mountain. Redemption. Okay? So far so good? Moving along here? Now, we understand that there's the mountains of separation. We understand that the mountain of separation is the great descent. The descent of it all. We understand that the intended descent gets perversed when we have the unintended descent. Did you ever see what you say in your Yom Kippur, Al Chet? We ask God for the sins of the Yetzer Hara. Sins of the Yetzer Hara. And the answer is, teachers tell us, that there are some sins that even the Yetzer Hara didn't dream of getting us to do. This descent of mountains of separation was not meant for sin. It was meant for freedom of choice, to make every one of our choices precious. There is an interesting statement in the Zohar, Shedim Meshedim Yehudayin Veshedim Meshedim Achroin. Literally it means the demons of Jews, the demons of the demons of Gentiles. Now, no, in the Zohar, when we talk about Jews and Gentiles, we're talking about not the human manifestation of it just. We're talking about holiness and impurity, back to back, face to face. The fact that Jews 24/7 have the code of Jewish law breathing down their back It's because we have to have a face-to-face relationship with God. So our eating has to be according to Jewish law. Our dressing has to be according to Jewish law. Do you even know that it actually in Jewish law tells you what side you should be laying when you fall asleep and what side you have to wake up on? You're not allowed to lay on your back. You're not allowed to lay on your stomach. You're supposed to lay after midnight, before midnight, on the left side, wake up on the right side. What is God doing under the covers with me? Face-to-face relationship. That's what happens. Thus, when you talk about in the Zohar, the demons of Jews, what are we talking about? We're talking about sins which seem to be Jewish. Now, out there in the world, we refer to blue collar and white collar. I'm not going to say that's what it means. Stealing isn't an okay sin. We're talking about the egocentric, which doesn't lead you to do what's wrong. It leads you to do what's right with the wrong intentions. But when you cross the line of not doing what's right with the wrong intentions, but doing what's wrong, you have perversed the original plan of the mountains of separations. Thus, you have taken the descent to the ultimate descent. Not only is it in the ultimate darkness of the physical, but now it has become in the ultimate darkness of sin. To explain to you this, and it's not on my notes, I just want to make it clear. To explain this to you very clearly, the Alter Rebbe says, a pig is not kosher. And the Jews, when we want to insult someone, pig. Right? But you understand that a pig did nothing wrong? A pig is as it was meant to be. The pig was meant to be a pig. Thus, the Alter Rebbe writes in Tanya, when a Jew sins, he's worse than a pig. He's worse than anything that is impure. Because that which is impure is what it was created to be. When you use freedom of choice to do what you were not meant to do, you've taken darkness, i.e. rebellion, to a whole new level. Now we have to understand, why did God let that happen? And then you're going to ask me, what do you mean? God didn't let it happen, right? What do we say? God doesn't make wars, humans make wars. So I'm just going to answer it very simply and move right along. My teacher gave me the best way to handle this before we get into the whole theological conversation. Foresight, freedom of choice. Hindsight, meant to be. Thus, even your sins, after they were done, were meant to be. For were they not meant to be, they wouldn't have happened. With all our freedom of choice, what we're not going to do is mess up God's game. So that doesn't work foresight, but it works hindsight. Okay? So again, I ask you, why did God let this happen? And the answer is, in the words of Kabbalah, the answer is Yerida Tzorech Aliyah. The descent for the sake of ascent, as the lion which crouches before it pounces. For without the crouch, it could not pounce that high. Going back to what the Talmud said. We're burying seeds for a harvest. So that means that the whole purpose of the Harei Boser, the whole reason for the mountains of separation, not just the separation of Mother Nature and contraction, but the separation of what happened on Monday when God told the moon to belittle itself, and the separation which happened when Adam and Eve ate from the tree of knowledge, which then later led to all the other sins. At that point, even that was for the only sake of profiteering. What does profiteering mean? Reaching excessive, unfair. If all I'm supposed to get from exile is back to the Holy Temple, then the whole journey was a waste of time. Would you do that, Amir? Would you invest $100,000 to make back in 5 years $100,000? No. Who would do that? I invest $100,000 for 5 years to make back $1 million. Now we're talking. Thus you understand that the descent for the sake of ascent is unprecedented ascent. Now we understand the language we're talking about here. We're not talking about reaching the power of Moses when he brought us the Torah, which is sight and hearing. We're talking about reaching Spice Mountain, which is the fragrance, which is the essence connection. That can only happen not when we're studying Torah in the good old days, but specifically in the gardens of strangers' exile, being under impurity. Because only in the power of this descent do we get to ascent. Thus, we're going to move on now to understand another concept. When we talk about Spice Mountain, we're going to clearly state that we're talking about the ultimate power of spice, which is incense and not sacrifices. Now here itself, a question needs to be asked, because what is the process of the sacrifice? It's to take not the godly soul, but the animal soul, the animalistic soul, the physical darkness within the human, and to bring that upon the altar. So that already is transformation. And therefore, what does the verse say about every sacrifice? Reach nechoyach. We have brought a pleasant fragrance to God. That means even sacrifices brings pleasant fragrance. Thus I ask, why do we have to talk about the incense? Why do we need incense? Spice Mountain can refer to the fragrance which God says all over Leviticus concerning the sacrifices. But no, we're talking about the depth. To understand that, we need to understand a little bit what's going on here. Number one, you should know that sacrifices other than a rare few, Yom Kippur and a rare few sin offerings, they're all brought on the outside altar, the earthen altar. The incense is brought daily, half in the morning, half in the evening, on the golden altar inside. Now that's going to lead us to a problem. Why? Because when it comes to number 11, we're clearly taught, and there's a quote, Eser v'lo chadeser. Holiness has to have 10 emanations. Holy emanations is 10 and not 11. Clearly it says that about holiness. When it comes to using the emanations of evil, impurity, what do we say? Yud Aleph Kisrin Debishin. We're talking about the 11 crowns of impurity. So thus we need to understand, why is holiness 10 and why is impurity 11? And the answer is, there's only 10 emanations. You know them. The 3 intellects, right? Wisdom, understanding, knowledge. The 7 emotions. You have the first 6 male emotions. Then you have the 7th feminine mystique of kingship. There's only 10. So why do you say 11? Because there's 10 vessels and there's a infinite light. In holiness, the vessels are willing to open up and internalize the light. Thus, we don't have to count 11, 10 vessels and 1 light. Rather, what are we saying? 10 sphirot. But because the impurity in its total arrogance and ego and opaqueness does not allow for the light to permeate it, thus you have the 10 vessels and the light is stuck encompassing it from the outside. Thus, when it comes to evil and impurity, we say 11. Now let's go on further. We say 11, but why do we have to call them crowns? Crowns. To understand this, we need to go to Genesis. What does it say in Genesis? Let me read to you the exact wording. It says like this. It says, and these are the kings who reigned in the land of Edom before any king reigned over the children of Israel. Wow. I want to put a pause for a second because I did leave out 2 important facts. I told you about number 11. One of the 11 is called chelbana. In English, that's called frankincense. Frankincense has a bad smell. On top of that, we clearly learn out from a law in the Talmud, it's in the notes, you can look up the exact quote, that it could be made in impurity and then brought in. It could be made on the outside, you can't use impurity. It doesn't have to be made like everything else in the Holy Temple for the sake of holiness. On top of that, you remember I quoted to you myrrh before, M-Y-R-R-H? So I want to just share with you that if you look up what myrrh is, There's different opinions. One opinion is it actually comes from a non-kosher animal, from the musk moose, which is non-kosher, which is incredible, because you cannot use anything for a mitzvah which is non-kosher to the mouth. Thus, you can only bring sacrifices from a kosher animal. When it comes to incense, A, it's 11, B, it includes the bad smell one, C, it even has a non-kosher there. We're talking about a much deeper transformation than sacrifices. And how do we understand that? We understand it with the next statement, why they're called crowns. They're called kings. I want to just do this short because I want to keep it within the time limit. Oof, that ain't going to happen. So let's just keep it quick. What we have about is, no, that's different. Honey's not a problem right now. Let's talk about something else right now. When we talk about the kings that reigned before Israel, what do we see here? Two things. Impurity is called kings, and they were before the kings of Israel. In Kabbalah, before means higher. That means the kings of Edom, the offspring of Esav, is higher than the kings of Israel. How do you figure that? And the answer is because we're taught that there's the world of Tohu, chaos, and there's the world of Tikkun, which is correction. The world of Tohu basically is powerful infinite light within thin vessels, which is unsustainable. And therefore, ultimately, we're taught that the vessel shattered. And once the vessel shattered, it fell into Tikkun. What is Tikkun? Tikkun is orderliness. Why is it orderliness? Because the light is weakened and contracted, and the vessels are thick, and thus it's sustainable to keep the lights in the vessels. So on one hand you have Tohu, which is more powerful, but that's chaotic and it's shattered. On the other hand you have Tikkun, which is orderly, but it's weaker, but it's sustainable. And then what happens? The great pieces of Tohu fall into the world of Tikkun. Why did all this happen? For one simple reason. To reach the ultimate destiny. What is the ultimate destiny in the exact words of Kabbalah? To have the lights of Tohu in the vessels of Tikkun. That would be perfect. Powerful infinite light in thin vessels, a no-no. Weakened light in thick vessels, not the best you can do. But through that shattering, scooped up by Tikkun, we now have the ultimate scenario of the powerful infinite lights of Tohu within the thick, powerful vessels of Tikkun. Just that you should know, that is exactly what was going on with Esav and Jacob. Isaac saw Esav being the firstborn. That means he's Tohu. That means he's powerful. Thus Isaac loved Esau. He loved the powerful infinite light. However, this powerful infinite light descended into evilness within the world of orderliness. Rebecca sees this. Rebecca says, Jacob, the blessings of Tohu have to be embodied by you. The great light of Tohu will only be sustainable when it's housed within Jacob, which is the vessels of Tikkun. So now we understand what's going on here. You have the infinite sparks that fell into Tikkun. Now what happens when the infinite sparks fall? Just like Esau, infinite chaos manifests itself in... Esau was not a good man. Remember I told you why we're going to talk about why only in suffering. The power of Tikkun is, when do you do the ultimate transformation of the mountains of separation, i.e. Tohu, and turn them into the spice mountain, i.e. Tikkun? How do you do that? It's only when you can put yourself into the gardens of strangers, within the gardens of strangers, see beyond the outer shell of evil, realize that it's all about sitting in the shul, in the house of study, prayer and study. So by curbing yourself, fall back on the last classes, put the yud on the daled, be humble, cut down the letter, the leg of the kuf, it shouldn't go too low, by staying within the laws of what's correct and what's not incorrect, then you can have the powers of tohu within the vessels of tikkun. But when you're living in the times of King Solomon in the Holy Land, you're not connecting with the lights of tohu, because that has fallen into the gardens of strangers. That has fallen into the mountains of separation. So it's only when God brings us out into the gardens of strangers, and there we behave correctly. Not a resh without the humble yud, but a dalid. Not a kuf with a leg that goes way down into the pit of scorpions and snakes, but keep it as a hey. Then we're enabled to be able to elevate. Connect with those sparks and elevate. Thus we have the light of tohu within tikkun. Now we're talking about not sight or hearing, we're talking about smelling. We're talking about essence. And thus it's specifically not the sacrifices which could be taking place in the times of King Solomon, but we're speaking on a metaphysical, spiritual, personal level of incense, where we're taking the chelbana, the number 11, the mur, and we're using that to be able to get through it, profiteering from our suffering. This is not on my notes, and it's just coming to me now as I'm talking to you. So I'm just going to let it go out there. Picasso was a very unique artist. Unlike many of his fellow artists, he didn't live in chaos. Many artists, their masterpieces, you can see that they were lights of tohu in the vessels of tohu, struggling, suffering people. Something you need about Picasso, if in the world of art I'm going to make a correlation, he's like a Jacob that received the blessings and was able not to go crazy in order to present his art. My own little, as a great connoisseur of art, I just wanted to share that with you. But I just wanted you to feel the difference. And I'm not calling Rembrandt Asel, and I'm not getting into the argument whether he cut off his ear because of an epileptic or whatever. I'm not getting into all of that. But I'm just sharing with you, there's a very clear difference when you're in the throes of the lights of tohu without having healthy boundaries of the thick vessels of tikkun. And you'll have that in every area of your life. In your love life, in your business life, in your religious life, you're going to have it all over. So if you can't put the yud on the back, be humble, and you can't cut down the kuf to size to be a hey, there's a problem. And the whole reason why we went into exile is to experience the lights of tohu in the vessels of tikkun. That's what Mashiach is all about. Now we can go back to the seeds and the harvest. So God planted the seeds, i.e. the Jews, in the great big earth, i.e. the mountains of separation, where tohu sparks are hidden. And now let's go back to the Talmudic saying, God didn't send us into exile only in order to gather converts. One little question. 2,000 years in exile, and the number of converts does not equal great numbers yet. So the question is, where is the investment here? Thank God we've picked, from Ruth all the way down to local converts. You're talking about beautiful. But 2,000 years in exile, what's going on here? So that Rizal has a very interesting teaching. Rabbi Isaac Luria, he says, the great Kabbalist in Tzfat, he says, times a bit Yosef, around 500 years ago, he says something very interesting. He says, when the Talmud talks about converts here, it's not just humans, it's all converts. I.e., the tohu sparks that fell into evil that need to be converted, them too. Now we understand the bigger picture. Human converts is the peak of the mountain of a whole mountain of converts, which are all those tohu sparks that we're bringing back into the vessels of tikkun. That's how you make a spice mountain. That can't happen when we're in Israel, not in exile. Thus we understand the whole purpose of exile is to profiteer from our suffering. Profiteer from our suffering by bringing back converts. Converts of every single style. Including all those godly sparks that fell, the infinite passions that fell into all the other arts, bring it back into Judaism. Lights of Torah in the vessels of Tikkun. Let's close it up right now. So let's get back to the opening thing. My friends, how do you profiteer from your own suffering? How do you do that? I'm going to share with you my understanding from this whole mimer. My understanding is the main key here in order to profiteer from my own suffering, each one of us, from our own level, is by focusing on the gazelle and the fawn of hind. It is amazing that if you can focus on the one-eyed gazelle who's watching you and protecting you in your sleep, if you can focus on that fawn of hind, that even when you think he's walking out on you, he's forever loving you unconditionally and watching you. We're talking about God. Here is a fact. Those who cannot feel God's love, even in time of abundance, will not have extreme profit. While those who can feel loved unconditionally, watched by the one-eyed gazelle, looked at by the fawn of hind, in their suffering, real suffering, physical, emotional, intellectual, every level of suffering, the people who can still feel loved by God and see the gazelle looking at them, see the fawn of hind keep on looking back at them, these are the individuals that just excel in unfair profit even in time of suffering. To me, that's the focus of this mimer. To me, that's what gets you to see the shul in your exile, to see your house of study in the exile, to see the lights of Tohu for the taking. Only because you very consciously feel the one-eyed gazelle. You feel the fawn of hind. If I know that God is watching me and God loves me and God's protecting me and God's empowering me, then suffering is nothing more than a land of opportunity for true profiteering. Thank you.
You're welcome.